Alan, for that very generous, lengthy introduction. As they say, were they still with us, my father would have liked it and my mother would have believed it. We've gotten a lot of food. First of all, let me say also thank you for inviting me into your beautiful town this week. I was in Israel actually for a little longer than 10 days. I was long for 3 weeks for most of this last concluded war. And it's a pleasure to come here to your beautiful town and to this beautiful structure, of which you should all be very proud. This is quite an accomplishment, and it's really an honor to be here. Now, this film has given us a lot of food for thought, and I don't want to reiterate a lot of the points that we've been given and that we can discuss at length as we go on. But what I do want to do is to place it in perspective, and the perspective of the last month. Because this film was completed at the end of last year, or really, I guess, at the beginning of this year. And, in the news business, time moves on. But in the case of the events of the last several months, and in particular the events of the last few weeks, the message of this film is more important than even it was when it was first put to print. Because everything that we've seen in the last few weeks really just emphasizes the points that it tried to make to us. Now, let me first say, and it's a fair question that people ask, why focus on J Street? It's one more Jewish organization, and to be fair, it is by no means the most problematic in some ways for Israel right now. We heard of Jewish Voices for Peace. They are getting much louder, and if we believe the forward in a piece last week, that J Street is losing ground to the really openly anti-Zionist groups. But let's say a couple of things. First of all, J Street has invited this sort of focus because of its ambitions, because of its goal. It came into existence in part as sort of the Jewish rooting section for Obama after 2008. But more to the point, it was about replacing AIPAC as the voice of the pro-Israel community in this country, and indeed overturning the entire apple cart of American Jewish life, and to recast it in its own image of this supposed message of pro-Israel, pro-peace. But the point that I'd like to make to you, and that I think you should take away most from this, is that J Street, though it is, new, it's fresh, it's supposedly young, it is actually an anachronism. It is about the politics, it is about the policy choices of more than 20 years ago. Because if this was, say, 1992 or 1988, then what J Street is prescribing for Israel would be a reasonable position. Now, I'll admit I would disagree with it, and if you have the younger Jonathan Tobin in front of you from 20-odd years ago, I would have disagreed with it then. But I could not have denied that what it was saying, that Israel had to be pressured to make peace, that Israel had the power to change the conflict and end it with its own actions, it had a certain internal logic because, in fact, Israel had not yet made the sort of peace offers that it would in the years to come. We had not yet had the Oslo peace process. Not Oslo I, not Oslo II, not the Hebron Agreement. All the peace agreements that Israel signed that empowered the Palestinians, brought Yasser Arafat from Tunisia into Ramallah, brought the Palestinians autonomy, and then as if that wasn't enough, then the Camp David conference in 2000. I know most journalists tend to think that ancient history is what happened the day before yesterday, but it's still important to remember that Israel offered the Palestinians a Palestinian state in almost all of the West Bank and Gaza, and even a share in Jerusalem in 2000, and was turned down by Yasser Arafat. And then again in 2001, and he indeed answered that peace offer from Ehud Barak, the then Prime Minister of Israel, with a terrorist war of attrition. And if that wasn't enough, then in 2005, when Ariel Sharon withdrew every Israeli soldier, settlement, and settler from Gaza. There was no peace then. And again in 2008, I'm being tedious, I keep repeating myself. In 2008, Ehud Olmert, who we saw in this film saying that there was a peace partner, but in fact, when he offered the same peace deal, in fact, with a few additions to the Palestinian leader, not the cartoon villain Yasser Arafat, but the supposedly more moderate Mahmoud Abbas in 2008 after the Annapolis conference here in this country. What did Abbas do? Well, technically he didn't say no. He just fled the room. It was like one of those cop shows where they flee the vicinity. He fled. Rather than actually being forced to answer it one way or another, he left the negotiations. And now again in this last year, when Secretary of State Kerry promoted a new peace process, Israel again came to the table with it very clear that it would accept a two-state solution in exchange, again, for this terrible thing, for them to say those two terrible words, Jewish state. Abbas wouldn't do it. This was, in effect, a fourth denial, a fourth turn down of peace. Is that enough? Well, apparently not. Because what we saw in this last month, in this terrible war that I just had the privilege of being there with the Israeli people and to cover and to see the soldiers heading to the border and to spend weeks with the Israeli people ducking in and out of bomb shelters, we've seen that it is still not about the occupation. It is still not about whether Israel will agree to a two-state solution, which it has already numerous times agreed to. It is about whether there should be a Jewish state. We need to look at the news and see what we saw these last few weeks. It wasn't just rockets flying. There was those tunnels. The tunnels that were used, which the Palestinian, the Hamas, in what is in effect an independent Palestinian state in all but name in Gaza, as it has existed since 2005, and now it's under Hamas rule since 2007. All the aid that was poured into there by foreign donors, the concrete that even Israel let in, what was it used for? It was used to build a vast underground tunnel city in Gaza. In effect, and one of the things you heard in the media, that it was very unfair that Israelis, in this war, they weren't being killed in the same numbers that Palestinians were, for which Israelis were supposed to apologize, because the Israelis had bomb shelters and the Palestinians didn't. Well, actually, in Gaza, they did have bomb shelters. In fact, there is more reinforced concrete shelters underneath the surface of Gaza than there is per square mile than in any part of Israel. Unfortunately, the bomb shelters were for the bombs, not to shelter the people. They were for the Hamas fighters. Those, and I might add about those Hamas fighters whom you never saw on television. Those rockets that went up by their thousands. I can tell you, I was there. There was one night I was sitting with friends on their balcony in Modi'in, which their balcony had a good view of the coastal plain, and they also had an Iron Dome battery in their neighborhood, which was a military secret. But now I guess I can say it. And we watched the show for a while until the sirens that were in the distance started coming toward us, and then we took shelter in their safe room where their infant baby was sleeping and was awoken. Never wake up a sleeping baby. Hamas doesn't know that rule. But the Israelis Israelis tried to protect their people. Hamas used them as human shields repeatedly. And the media, which you saw and which liberal voices like the people we saw in this film, like Peter Beinart, kept saying that Israel is losing support because it's unsustainable for Israel to be doing all these beastly things to the Palestinians. And yet the same media, and it's because Israel's losing support, because how can you support a country that is being portrayed as doing all these bad things? And yet the same media that is facilitating this message And they were there in their hundreds inside, if not their thousands inside Gaza, yet never once did the New York Times or virtually any other newspaper publish a photo of a Hamas fighter who we know exists in their thousands. I guess they're like vampires. They can't be photographed. Never once during all the weeks of this conflict did you see a single piece of video, and we know that there was a lot of video cameras inside Gaza, of the rockets going up against Israel. Not once, and it's only in the last couple of days, if you've been watching the news, that Finnish and Indian reporters are now, once they left Gaza, are now showing videos of the rockets going up. Not merely the rockets going up, but going up in the vicinity of schools and of mosques and of shelters where Palestinians are staying, just as Israel said they were doing all along, and which the media tended to deny over these past few weeks. We've seen this, and we also saw the tunnels in which all that aid had been poured into. For what? For murder, for kidnapping, for what we now believe to be what was their plan, was a mass terrorist attack aimed for this coming Rosh Hashanah. That would have been a nice New Year's present to the world, wouldn't it have been? So what does this tell us? Well, we need to heed the message of the tunnels. They're telling us something. That when Hamas says that the resistance, as they call themselves, is about resisting the occupation, this occupation that J Street keeps telling us is the obstacle to peace, they aren't talking about the question of where the border should be, the theoretical border should be in the West Bank between Israel and a Palestinian state. They're talking about Israel inside the 67 borders, which Jeremy Ben-Ami says he supports. The whole point of this war was about this ongoing war of destruction against Israel and the Jewish people, and how this notion that if only Israel would do what J Street, what the left in this country in some cases, and in some cases the far right wants them to do, there would be peace. We've seen again in the last few weeks that this is a lie. This is just not true. And if we ignore that, we're ignoring so much that's important. Now, in understanding this, that leaves us with the question of what we are to do about this as a community. And that's what I most want to leave you with. And we can talk about more about Gaza. We can talk more about sort of the infighting. But what are we to do? The activities of groups like J Street that claim to be pro-peace and pro-Israel, but devote much of their energies to undermine Israel's democratically elected government and its friends here in the United States, are not only wrong on the issues, they're also fundamentally irrelevant to any rational discussion of the conflict. Because one of the most important things I can tell you is that J Street believes that American Jewry is divided between left and right, and between the people who are trying to suppress the vision of peace and the people who are speaking up for peace. But in terms of being pro-Israel, they need to listen to the people of Israel. Because I can tell you the people of Israel are not disunited on the question of their survival, of what it takes for their survival. And in a very fractious country, with divisive politics that makes our own look like beanbag, they are in their, by 90%, they support this government and in Jerusalem and what it's trying to do. And we need to understand that those who say that Israeli democracy needs to be invalidated and overridden by either American Jews who know better or by an American government that claims to know better, that they're irrelevant to what it means to be pro-Israel. The left versus right arguments that have animated so much of our discussions about Israel in the last 20 years are simply outdated, because contrary to the myths propagated by such false friends, the conflict would continue, albeit on even more disadvantageous terms for Israel, even if it withdrew every Jew from the West Bank and even from Jerusalem. The critics are wrong. An Israel that would supposedly be more acceptable to young Americans, as Jeremy Ben-Ami keeps telling us, wouldn't be loved any more than the real complex Israel that actually exists. If the history of the last 21 years since the Oslo Accords in 1993 teach us anything, it is that a policy of territorial surrender won't make Israel loved by its opponents. If anything, Israel's efforts to make peace have strengthened the resolve of its foes to persist in their goal of destroying Israel. In those 21 years, the vitriol against Israel has increased rather than diminishing. The peace process has had the ironic effect of bringing anti-Zionism from the margins to the mainstream in Europe and on American college campuses. We must meet the challenge posed to us by these critics head-on by asserting the justice of Israel's cause and of Zionism. We must not be afraid of turning off the faint of heart or supposedly the young when we confront these critics bluntly and tell them that Israel's cause won't be advanced by abandoning its people to their foes or by saving them from themselves or by denying the reality of the existential threat that still hangs over it. Our tent can and should be big, and Friends of Israel can, as Americans do in terms of our own politics, differ on a great many things. But we must be united in our understanding that the great divide today is not between left and right, as J Street would have it, but between those who comprehend that the conflict in the Middle East is not about settlements or borders or territory or even about terrorism. It is about whether the Jewish people are entitled to one homeland or not. That's what's at stake now. Listen to Hamas. That's what they're telling you. Listen to the Palestinian Authority when they're not speaking to the American press, and that's what they're telling you. Anyone who doesn't get that is not only not defending Israel against those who would destroy it. Anyone who doesn't get that is missing the point about the conflict. They're willfully deceiving themselves and others about what is at stake here. Whether it is cloaked in the rhetoric of the left or of the traditional right, anti-Zionism is merely the latest variant of an old and persistent virus, anti-Semitism. And if you didn't get that, you should have gotten that from watching the demonstrations in Europe, in Paris, where a synagogue was besieged by a mob throwing rocks, and in other instances all across Europe, and in the hateful rhetoric that we've even seen in the United States at anti-Israel demonstration these last few weeks. To be frank, anyone who would deny the Jews and their state the same rights and protections that they readily grant other people or any state, and who judge it by standards that they never apply to others, are simply practicing bias that we must not refrain from calling by its right name, Jew hatred. As much as we want and should want to be in a big tent with all of our neighbors and the entire Jewish people, we also need to understand, and that's the message of this film, that there is a difference between friends and foes, between those who work to strengthen Israel and those who seek to weaken it, or even worse, to aid those who seek its downfall. We cannot be afraid of labeling those who are ambivalent about boycotts of Israel and who support efforts to isolate it or who want pressure against it, against its government. They are not only not friends, but clearly beyond the pale of behavior, of acceptable behavior in our community and the secular world. Let's remember that those who follow the path of the critics, the Peter Beinarts, the Jeremy Ben-Amis, people who consistently work to undermine Israel, are taking the path of least resistance, not heroism. Though like some American foes of Israel, they claim that they're being persecuted for their beliefs, they are in fact following a very fashionable path which gives them prestige, if not particular honor. That leads us to the key question of what it takes these days to be a friend of Israel. Now, it is true, we must arm ourselves and our children with knowledge about the facts about this struggle. We must visit Israel. Yeah, even when times are bad, you can still visit Israel. And do everything to reinforce the message that support for Zionism is a litmus test of whether you're part of the Jewish community or a friend of the Jewish people. But I can tell you, after years of reporting, writing, editing, and taking part in endless discussions about these questions, I believe the struggle requires something even more essential from every one of us. And that element is courage. It is the quality above all that we must cultivate in our leaders and in our children. We must teach them to stand up for themselves and for our people and for the cause of Israel. The dynamic that those who seek to undermine support for the Jewish state is based on the willingness of too many of us to simply sit back and let them get away with it. We must teach ourselves and our children not merely the facts about the war against Israel that this film attempted to teach us, but also not be afraid of standing out when we speak up on its behalf, in spite of a media that paints Israel as a war criminal, in spite of criticism from the world. We must instill in ourselves and our children a spirit that will not allow them to be cowed by the brickbats of the critics. They must learn to have faith in the justice of this cause and to ignore the catcalls of those who claim they are out of step with fashion or the culture, as I hear everywhere I go. Now, that is admittedly not an easy thing to ask of anyone. It is hard to swim against the stream, to stand up against the crowd, to stand up against what you're seeing on television, to talk back to teachers. And this is not just about students or about communities. It's about, to be blunt, it's also about Jewish leadership. Because it's just as hard for some Jewish leaders to speak truth to power when they sit in the White House as it is for students to talk back to anti-Zionist professors in colleges. But that is what we must ask of them and ourselves. I believe Friends of Israel need to relearn what previous generations came to understand in past struggles for Jewish rights and existence. That those who will not stand up for the Jews will inevitably be asked, eventually, why they stood by while Jews were fighting and dying as they have been fighting and dying this past month without doing something about it. Our generation will be judged just as those who went before us. Just as one generation was judged, and I'm afraid judged harshly, by their failure to act during the Holocaust, and another is rightly praised for activism during the Soviet Jewry movement, we too will be judged. We must remember that our fiercest critics are not the Israel bashers or the people in the media, but our posterity, which will one day look back on this time and this moment, yes, this specific moment in time after what we've seen these last few weeks. And they will ask us what we did when Israel was under siege, when the missiles were flying and the tunnels were being dug and Jews were being threatened with death. What did we do while Jewish children cowered in bomb shelters, as I saw? While middle-aged Jewish guys, just like us, were taken away from their jobs and their homes and their families to go defend those families. What did we do when those missiles were fired from the Palestinian state that actually already exists in all but name? To be a friend of Israel today means, above all, refusing to stand by mutely on the sidelines as the Jewish state is treated as a pariah, while the terrorists who seek its destruction lie on television, and those who apologize for them are treated as celebrities and even heroes and are given virtual impunity for their war crimes because Israel had the temerity to shoot back. We must do so not in the name of a mythical perfect Israel, as our opponents sometimes claim, but on behalf of a living, breathing, imperfect, and at times, as anybody who's visited there knows, infuriating country. But that it is not judged by a double standard that is not applied to any other country. We must do so not because we like its politics or its leaders, you don't have to, or because we think that we should follow blindly, which we are not doing, but because it has the same right to exist in freedom and security as any other nation, including our own here. And we should do so with confidence. Yes, confidence, not fear. Because we should understand that support for Israel is deeply embedded in the political DNA of America, and that contrary to what J Street and others say, what they're always telling us, that we're losing support, in fact, the vast majority of Americans care deeply about Israel and oppose the efforts of those who wish to undermine it. When faced with the lies, the distortions, and the unfair criticisms that we've just learned a little bit about, what must we do? We must write, we must speak, we must act, we must do anything but to stand silent while the mob of appeasers and liars and anti-Semites howl for Israel's blood. We simply dare not fail to meet this challenge. Though some say that even time is against Israel, we hear that often, I tell you that we dare not fail because this is the moment for us to stand up. And I would say with God's help and with the courage of this community and communities all over this country, I believe with perfect faith that Israel will endure and triumph, and that Israel and its friends will emerge triumphant from this difficult chapter in history, no matter what J Street says. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.